Sorry, my notes froze up, so this is my paper. Thanks for coming. This is welcome to the School of Architecture's last evening lecture. Tonight we're very pleased to be able to welcome Dietrick Neumann, Professor of Modern Architecture and Urbanism at Brown University, as our last lecture of the fall. Dietrick studied architecture at the TU in Munich, where he also received his PhD, the AA in London, and has been teaching at Brown since more or less 1989. His wide-ranging work runs from the scale of building technologies, particular studies of lighting and illumination, to the scale of skyscrapers and the city, which I think will find a nice home at the school in particular. His books include, sorry for the awkwardness of the reading here, Film Architecture, Set Design from Metropolis to Blade Runner, Richard Neuter's Windshield House, Architecture of the Night, and The Structure of Light, a monograph on the lighting designer Richard Kelly. Currently, Dietrick is working on two books, one on the Barcelona Pavilion and another on urban planning and fascist Italy. The Society of Architectural Historians awarded Dietrick the Founders Award in 1997 and the Philip Johnson Award in 2001. He subsequently served as president of the SAH, and he's currently on the Committee of Architecture Design at the Museum of Modern Art. Last year, he was also in residence as a fellow at the American Academy of Rome, where he worked on conducted research on East Van der Rohe. I will say that the first time that I met Dietrick was at a Brown alumni event at the Ennis Brown House in Los Angeles, where he was showing films, basically showing how all of the bad guys and gangsters and evildoers in the world lived in really cool modern houses. And I said, this is the kind of research that I can get behind, and very inspirational. The other story which I just found out from Dietrick is that he's also, I didn't realize this, Jonathan never told me this, but Jonathan was his advisee at Brown. Now I realize my warm connection to Jonathan now. It really wasn't Canada after all. But I think that, in terms of Dietrick's work on really from the scales of building technology and lighting and illumination and really atmospheres and environments of architecture through set design to the questions of the city resonates with some of the things that we're trying to do here in terms of rethinking, expanding the material palette of architecture as materials and energies and their impact on design. So a great pleasure to be able to welcome Dietrick to our club, to be a member of our club now. So please join me in welcoming Dietrick Neumann.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for the kind introduction and for inviting me, and Jennifer as well. I don't know where she is. She did the correspondence that she's given me a wonderful tour of this amazing building that I really enjoyed when I arrived. Great to see Thomas Kelly again. We spent some time at the American Academy together, and Jonathan McKinnon, my former student. I had forgotten that we met at this Ennis Brown House. It's so long ago. The Ennis Brown a friend of mine just sent me because she knows about my interest in that building as a film set, a Michael Jackson video, which was filmed there. So that undermines the whole theory, of course, but maybe supports it. Who knows? That is open to discussion. Of course, at first I had thought maybe I'll do something on Mies van der Rohe, being not just in the city where he worked, but also at the university where his private library ended up. In your library, you hold the personal library of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, but then I decided to talk about something that has fascinated me recently, and I've just sort of put it together for a lecture, and that is the story behind this building that you see here, the Ford Foundation. A case study, so to speak. It's a very unusual and I think very interesting building. Its relationship to art is something I want to look into, and the people behind this building and its sort of design strategies, and as you'll see, not just the art, which I would argue is somewhat subversive in one ways and in others, and at the same time there's also something that I discovered during my research, which is a rather dark undercurrent. So I'll get to that in the second half of the lecture. And introduce some of these themes as we go along. This is the remarkable building of the Ford Foundation, New York City, on 42nd and 43rd Street. Some of you might have gone there and visited it. It was designed by Kevin Roach and John Dinkeloo, who had just started their own firm after Eero Saarinen, their former employer, died suddenly in 1961. The building committee had looked at Marcel Breuer, I.M. Pei, Henry Weiss, Skip Moix and Merrill, and Saarinen's office, which was then selected thanks to Kevin Roach. He had just passed away, except thanks to Kevin Roach's very vivid and inspired presentation. The building and its interior court with the garden deserve to be recognized as a major architectural achievement, I believe, but it is also a building that is embedded in a very complex interpretive landscape. The client was the Ford Foundation, then the wealthiest private philanthropic organization in the world, which was supporting educational and healthcare projects in developing countries around the globe. It had been founded in 1936 by Henry Ford and his son Edsel Ford. First had supported hospitals and museums in Michigan, and then in 1949, after the death of both founders, the Ford Foundation broadened its scope internationally and moved into an office building on Madison Avenue in New York City. By 1956, the foundation had become entirely independent from the Ford family and a public, non-profit, non-governmental organization. In the early years, they funded all kinds of educational projects in the United States, among them the founding of PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, and Sesame Street had a huge grant from the Ford Foundation at the beginning, and they gave fellowships to artists and actors. And then since the early 50s, they engaged in fighting poverty and diseases in developing countries. Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building of 1958, 10 years earlier, had had a major influence, as we all know, on public space in New York City. The bold decision to move the building back from the street and thus create a public plaza effectively ended the age of the setback skyscraper. You still see a little bit of the setback here in the foreground of the Seagram building, and in the background there with the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Ended the age of the setback skyscraper in New York and led to a change in the zoning code, which made Mies's exception the new rule. High-rise developers could purchase permissions for more stories by providing open plazas. The board of the Ford Foundation decided that a new building would be a way to represent the foundation and its ethics and goals better than the rented floors in an office building on Madison Avenue, and together with the architects, they decided to be ostentatious about being humble, meaning it would not exploit the plot of land it had purchased to its legal limits in order to maximize its profits, but rather it created a building that simply provided the space needed, but also something else, better working conditions for those inside and a pleasant space for the public year-round. Kevin Roach pointed out in an interview that the building could have been 2.5 times as high as it was built and still have room to spare. Any profit-oriented business, as you can imagine, would have, of course, gladly built as high and wide as possible and rented out the additional office space, just as it happened in the Seagram building. Public space in front would have brought additional rentable floors. Of course, foregoing such additional income was an enormous luxury. We see here some of Kevin Roach's early designs where he's playing with the massing that he needed, and we see first, here's the massing, different versions, and then we see an open space emerging, also an interior courtyard. On the right, there are a few of his unpublished sketches from his private archive, partially now at Yale University, where I found them and photographed them. And we also see how he's thinking of putting something on the top. Kevin Roach is really quite an interesting figure. He had worked on some of the boldest Saarinen designs when he was still in Saarinen's office, and then Saarinen died unexpectedly, very suddenly, of a heart attack in 1961. And it was Kevin Roach and John Dinkeloo who basically had been the lead designers and finished all these projects. So you see the dates here. So the St. Louis Arch, they finished from 61, which is when Saarinen died, to 66. The famous DWA terminal, they finished until 62, so it was pretty close to being finished. Same with Dallas Airport, finished in 62, all after Saarinen had died. And then while Kevin Roach was working on the design of the Ford Foundation, he also already designed the New Haven Coliseum, which many of you might have an image of in your head. and the Knights of Columbus Tower there on the left. It was a similarly bold move, a parking structure on top of an entertainment arena, which was famously plagued by structural and planning deficiencies from the start, and was finally demolished in the year 2007. I was teaching at Yale at that time, and we all went out in the morning. It was a cold January morning in 2007, and stood on the parking deck. Some of you can't see it, I guess it's down here. Stood on the parking deck of Rudolph's garage, seeing this enormous building fall into being imploded and destroyed at that moment. It was sort of a rather sad moment for a piece of very, very bold architecture. But we see, of course, the beginnings of this bold gesture here in that sketch for the Ford Foundation just a few years before. Kevin Roach himself, by the way, credited a visit to the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver of 1892, just around the time when he was starting to design the Ford Foundation, as one of his inspirations. What resulted was the invention of a large light-filled atrium, 12 years Kevin Roach building the model, 12 stories high, visible from 42nd Street, in the sightline of the United Nations, and on 43rd Street, it had the facade of a typical office building, if you like. You can see here both of these facades very well, and of course the floor plan came out rather L-shaped. The square that in many buildings would be placed in front of the building had been, which was sort of a new theme in New York City architecture after the Seagram building, had been placed inside of the building, was filled with plants and trees, and provided a much-noted indoor garden. The architects, together with the client, had carefully conceived a building that, as I said earlier, exemplified the philanthropic, non-profit character of the institution it housed. So the interior, one could argue, stood in the tradition of large greenhouses, which in the 19th century in Paris and London and elsewhere had been the site already for public entertainment. You see here a few examples of those greenhouses, Crystal Palace among them, but predecessors and followers, of course, a very important genealogy for this building. Its enormous success of the Ford Foundation also had an influence on Kevin Roach's own work. He would use of interior spaces again and again. The inside, as you can see here, shows the structure made out of corten steel here on the left, and in warm dark brown colors. There was much brass at the doors and windows, and custom designed furniture by interior designer Warren Putner. Shortly after the opening, in 1967, the building was extensively photographed and published, and it was immediately welcomed by many positive reviews. I want to just begin with a few of those reviews of famous architecture critics, such as Ada Louise Huxtable. You've probably heard of her. She was the critic for the New York Times for many years, just passed away just fairly recently. And she wrote, she called it an architectural spectacular, a civic gesture of beauty and excellence, a shimmering crystal palace. And she said, and I quote, "It was probably one of the most romantic environments ever devised by corporate man." Beautifully put. And Paul Goldberger, who many of you of course know as well, still active. I think he writes for Vanity Fair now after a long time at the New York Times and the New Yorker. Great critic. He said, "One Ford Foundation philanthropy that, by its very presence on the streetscape, benefits the entire city." The New Yorker magazine agreed, "This building itself may well be the soundest educational investment the foundation has made to date, for it shows the way to an altogether new kind of urban environment." The building won a 1968 Art Award for excellence in architecture and urban design. But there's a palpable difference between the exuberant general architecture critics such as Goldberger and Ada Louise Huxtable, who were overwhelmed by the impression of that interior space with the green plants in it and this public garden, and some academics who saw a disconnect between that gesture and the exquisiteness and obvious expense of the design inside. One of the most perceptive observers was a man called Jonathan Barnett, still around, an architect and urban planner trained at Yale, and later longtime professor at Penn in the architecture school. His critique in the architecture record shows that he found the ostentatious humbleness not entirely convincing. And I quote him, he said, "The design, which might be expected to produce a sense of informality, openness, and candor, is actually highly charged with a symbolic content that invests the most ordinary aspects of the building's life with an almost ritualistic significance. And he goes on, each office is done in the same rich palette of subdued natural materials. Almost all the metal trim in the building is brass. That is, one knows it is brass, but actually one thinks of it as solid gold, the ancient prerequisite of priests and kings. The pervasiveness of gold elevates everything to the status of cult objects. Similarly, Kenneth Frampton, great critic, still professor at Columbia, he's in his 80s, wonderful guy, and I see him occasionally. He wrote, a custom-made monument down to the very last door spring. No expense has been spared, so much so that one can only be skeptical of the published contract figure of $16.5 million, excluding furnishing and design, rumor having it that the real figure is almost twice the amount. So there's a certain sense of suspicion towards this organization and the way it presents itself. While the offices were occasionally decorated, now to the art for a moment, with modest prints from the Yale Art Collection, 2 pieces of art were commissioned for the building. The choice of the artists and their work was clearly meant to be a careful part of the organization's self-representation. Sheila Hicks is the artist who was commissioned, very interesting person. She had studied art at Yale under Joseph Albers, and in particular studied textile art with Albers' wife Annie, who had both been at the Bauhaus in Germany, and Annie Albers stood in the tradition of her teacher at the Bauhaus, a woman called Una Stölzel, who did weavings such as this that would really sort of rethink what a tapestry could be about. Abstract forms, colors exploding, in a way, our sort of expectations of a rug or a tapestry. And you see her here, down here, Sheila Hicks with Joseph Albers. And Sheila Hicks had lived in Chile and Mexico, was deeply influenced by Inca and Andean weaving techniques, which had been the subject of her final thesis at Yale in the art department. And here's some work that she did just before her work for the Ford Foundation. Quite interesting. I see a bit of an influence maybe of Mark Rothko and so on, but also clearly the Bauhaus tradition of rethinking weaving and its sort of framework of expectations. Interesting. For this commission at the Ford Foundation, and only here, she completely abandoned her wildly informal patterns, inspired by folk and pre-Columbian art, which certainly had helped her getting the commission, and opted for something entirely regular in a color she had never used before. She created 2 enormous wall coverings with rows of golden discs, no doubt to stay in tune to the interior predominance of the color, but perhaps also a reference to the enormous wealth and power that the foundation wielded. The golden discs looked like so many gold coins. And of course, the year is 1967. The Vietnam War is in full catastrophic mode. And one might add, one cannot help but think that those discs also looked like the hats of Vietnamese rice farmers. That's not entirely unlikely that this was meant as a piece of subversive art. I talked to her about it. She lives in Paris. I just gave her a call and said, so what were you thinking about? And I suggested to her, I told her what I thought. And she didn't really want to buy into or confirm what I had suggested, my interpretation, but she didn't rule it out either. She said, well, you know, this is open to potential interpretations. These are round forms, so obviously a number of associations are possible. But it was clearly she didn't want to go on record as being subversive, because what had just happened is really quite interesting. In the 1980s, when stricter fire regulations were introduced, the tapestries were soaked by an over-eager fire marshal in a flame retardant, so they wouldn't go up in flames if there was a fire in the Ford Foundation. And the flame retardant did not work very well with those fabrics, so shortly afterwards they started to disintegrate, and then the entire mural fell apart. And Sheila Hicks finally decided just a year ago that it should be reinstalled. She took the initiative and rebuilt the entire thing from scratch at her own accord, and expense, and it was reinstalled in New York City in the Ford Foundation just 3 weeks ago. And so I called her up, and she had just gotten back from New York installing this, and I don't think she wanted to be on record as being subversive to what the Ford Foundation was about. I'll just quickly show you, this is what it looks like today. So there's one enormous mural, tapestry, whatever you want to call it, with those hundreds of golden discs in the lecture hall in the basement, another one in the boardroom. The other piece, oh yeah, here, this is what these discs look like in close-up, and back to the Ford Foundation. The other piece of art commissioned for the building was, of course, the garden inside. We had already mentioned that the building's signifying feature had been the fact that the outdoor plaza, as for example in front of the Seagram building, had been moved inside. Outdoor plazas had become obvious locations for public art. In the case of the Seagram Plaza, as some of you might know, Mies had made some drawings for sculptures on it. This is one of his drawings for the sculptures, and here's his drawing of the plaza, one of the few that we have of this building from Mies's own hand. And he then decided that the water basins with the fountains and the people walking across the plaza would actually suffice. But since then, the plaza has housed a long series of only temporary installations, be they the famous Olmec Head in 1966, or more recently, Urs Fischer's Bearland, very strange piece of 2011, as some of you might know. Across the street, of course, Lever House, Lever Building, has several Noguchi sculptures in its courtyard, and in many other cases, a public sculpture would regularly appear on a new plaza as a well-calculated gesture towards the public. Be they the Calder at the Federal Center here in Chicago, that you all know, the Picasso in Daly Plaza, or Noguchi's famous Red Cube in Manhattan. The New York Times critic Roberta Smith once claimed, in the 1960s and 70s, public sculpture was contemporary art's foremost fatality, deader than painting actually. The corpse generally took the form of corporate pseudo-minimalist plot art, she called it. It was ignored by the general public and despised by the art world. The Ford Foundation and its architect decided not to adorn its indoor plaza with a sculpture, which might have been seen critically as a misuse of its funds, but rather something that befitted a benevolent institution such as this foundation, and they hired garden designer Dan Heine. He had worked with Sarian's office before, knew Kevin Roach quite well, but this was his first indoor garden, and it could hardly have been more ambitious. He told the New York Times in this article that he imagined not just to decorate an interior, instead, my goal is to fill the vertical void. To develop the large spatial quality, the planting will be a grove of architecture, with the forms of the tree trunks rising up to that 150-foot heights, basically filling the entire atrium, to satisfy the geometric quality, he said. He clearly imagined his work as an enormous sculptural installation. Here are some of his drawings that I found at Harvard, the archive there, which holds his drawings. You see here the initial drawings of the plantings and the initial height of the trees that he imagined basically to double in height over time. He mentioned that he planted, and he did plant, for the opening, 37 trees, among them 35-foot high southern magnolias, which would have large white flowers in the summer, a Brazilian jacaranda tree, red ironbark eucalyptus, as well as 30 feet tall Japanese cryptomeria, 250 pots with small flowering plants, daffodils followed by tulips, begonias, as well as chrysanthemums and poinsettias for Christmas were to be planted. In addition, there were thousands of ground-covering plants, shrubs, and vines. Interestingly, the foundation, the Ford Foundation, budgeted $70,000 each year just to keep the garden going and replenish and take care of all those trees and bushes and ground covers, etc. That is clearly a sum that would have very quickly amounted to much more than even the largest Calder or Picasso sculpture would have cost. Kylie explained that the garden was lit with 76 spotlights from above at night, and there was a 40–50% humidity, but in the winter only 10% because of air conditioning, etc. So there wouldn't be any tropical plants, just plants for a northern climate. And he said, and I quote, "I long for the time when the trees will reach up to 150 feet. What I'm trying to express is a more poetic, spatial thing." So clearly imagining this as an enormous sculpture inside, very, very powerful, and real sort of contrast to the architecture, and something that in a way balances it out. Alas, it was not to happen. Most of the plants died over the course of the next year and had to be replaced with hardier, much smaller subtropical plants, which you see there today. I want to take you inside just for a moment to give you an impression of the space there. And let me just open this photograph. It will come up in a second, and I'll show you what it looks like. I took that photo there, and here it is. Let me just take it in home. So here we are standing inside the fourth foundation, and so let me just look up. Here's this incredible perspective. There's also plantings of trees up in the upper floors, 12-story atrium. Here are those lamps that he talked about. Here's the main facade. So this is the L form, these two sides. Here's the Corten steel. And as you can see here, the sort of effect of a slightly darker interior than the outside would be, makes the sort of visibility, increases the visibility inside the offices very much. And so going back to, sorry, I don't make you seasick. He's a Japanese architecture student, the only other visitor at that moment when I was in there. And you can look up here, I think you get a good idea what it looks like. But of course the trees are much, much smaller than Kylie had imagined. Here's a little area where you can walk around. And one gets a strange feeling. When you walk in there, somehow you feel the sort of great gift that Kevin Roach provided for the Ford Foundation is sort of dealt with rather grudgingly. They close at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and when you walk in, there are guards immediately confronting you. And they instruct you not to bring any beverages inside, and you are not allowed really to, I had to get special permission to take these photographs. It was like a nightmare to get those. And there's not a single bench, so you can't sit down and spend any time. It struck me as odd, you know, it's a philanthropic organization, right? So a bench would have been a nice philanthropic gesture, right? It would have costed that much, I guess, you know. Interestingly, if we return to the voice of the critics, 1968 or 69, when it was open, right? 69, Kenneth Franklin noticed exactly the same thing already, just when it opened, and he wrote, but almost, oh, sorry, I have to get out of this to go to my, he said, but almost at once, it becomes apparent that what promised to be a public space is in essence an anti-agora, invaded by the vegetative processes of nature, and that there remains nothing for man to do but to leave. Exactly my feeling when I was there. There was nothing you could do. You look around and the guards watch you very carefully if you're touching anything, and then you basically, you know, you're glad to be out of it. There was clearly a sense of uneasiness among intellectuals with this organization, the Ford Foundation, whose policies abroad were often questioned just as much as its independence from the government. Vincent Scully, great historian, you've all heard of him, or some of you have probably met him or read his books, great historian at Yale. Another critic, he said, complex, the building was complex and ominous. Military scale on the street, sultanic inner garden. The firm continues to sense, the firm of Kevin Roach and Charlie Glue, continues to sense and to embody the most deeply seated, perhaps unconscious, aspirations of its political and corporate clients. I mean, one has to love it. Sultanic inner garden, it's just beautiful. Suggested some sort of mirage or make-believe, if you like. But let's come back to Jonathan Barnett, really brilliant guy. I actually sent him an email saying I thought what you wrote there was absolutely brilliant. He was delighted. He's in his 80s and still doing all kinds of book pen and online courses and so on. So let's hear what he said a little more in Architectural Record, because he was the one who observed the building most closely. And I think this sort of close reading of the building can really teach us something. He looked at the cross-section of the building and found something truly astonishing. It had morphed from the original open corner that you see here into something a little more complex, with 2 floors of offices at that corner instead of the openness. And then he describes, here you see it, so it changed from this to this, with 2 additional floors rounding off the corner there. And he describes and says the following: the president of the Ford Foundation is visibly above everyone else. One can look up and see him from virtually every point in the building, because the president is in the lower one of these 2 stories to the street facade, not part of the L. So he sits there. In this cross-section you can read it, so it's the lower one of these offices right here. And he says, one can look up, if you are in the building, and see him from virtually every point in the building. Basically, look at all the blue arrows coming from people sitting somewhere in the building. They can all see their president up there in this glass office there in the center. What he did not mention was that this also meant, of course, that the president could see everyone else in the building in a sort of spatial panoramic fashion, right? He could look down from his office at this corner there into all the other offices. And you see here there's very little reflection in the glass because you have much less skylight. So you have a view into the depth of all of these offices. Quite interesting, I think. And there's sort of a spatial panoramic fashion, if you like, that someone like Jeremy Bentham and Michel Foucault would have recognized, of course. So if we look here, so from the left it would be the president's office, and he could look into everyone else's office. And now Jonathan Barnett continues. But directly above his head is the office of the chairman of the board, whose office is the only one adjoining the court that does not look out on it. And you see here, that's the one at the top floor, which is entirely closed. The 2 offices seem to become the visible and invisible manifestations of a mysterious power. So who are the president and above him the chairman of the board of the Ford Foundation at this moment? Henry T. Heald was the president and John J. McCloy was the chairman of the board. It's really a remarkable coincidence to have these 2 men here at this moment when the building is being designed and finalized in the building committee. And I went through the archive of the Ford Foundation, and neither one of these men missed a single meeting of the building committee. You see here one of those protocols, and they're both there, Henry T. Heald and John J. McCloy, and then there's Urban Miller and Stephen Bechtel, a great construction company, etc., etc. Both Heald and McCloy had an intense interest in architecture. Heald had brought Nice on the road to IIT when he was its president in the 1930s. John J. McCloy had been chairman of Chase Manhattan and overseeing the rise of its new headquarters in downtown Manhattan. You can see it there, after orchestrating its merger with Chase and Manhattan banks. And you see the Noguchi sculpture, another piece of public sculpture there in the lower court in front. John J. McCloy is someone we have to talk about for a moment. He's an astonishingly interesting and complex figure. He was almost Forrest Gump. Does that ring? Do you know Forrest Gump? Almost Forrest Gump-like. Involved in practically all major political decisions and events in 5 decades. It's astonishing, really astonishing. Thanks to these books, which I've read, The Cultural Cold War, The Chairman, John J. McCloy, The Making of the American Establishment, won a Pulitzer Prize, America and the Intellectual Cold Wars in Europe. Thanks to these books, we know a lot about it. He went to Amherst and Harvard, and then became a lawyer and banker, representing, among others, the Rockefellers, whom he counted among his friends. He lived in Italy for a year in the 1930s and worked out substantial American credits for the regime of Benito Mussolini. He also worked out credits for Adolf Hitler's chemical giant IG Farben in Germany. For one afternoon during the 1936 Berlin Olympics, he was Hitler's guest in his private box in the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. During the war, he had become Assistant Secretary of the War, a very, very powerful position, basically the key position under the president. He was the one who was responsible for the internment of more than 100,000 Japanese American citizens without recompensation after the attack on Pearl Harbor. See them here at the top right. He was in favor, he had been in favor of warning the Japanese population before the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the center, but he was unsuccessful. But he was the one afterwards who wrote the text for the capitulation documents. During the war, when news about the atrocities at Auschwitz had leaked out and desperate pleas were sent to the American military to bomb the rail lines leading there to Auschwitz. He refused several times, using different and always clearly untrue justifications. So they weren't bombed, and the atrocities and the killing, of course, in Auschwitz continues. And I'm sure it's a rabid anti-Semite. 1947, he was also, after the war, part of the Potsdam Conference. You see him here arriving in Berlin at the same moment, and Stalin and Truman arrived there for the conference. In 1947 to 49, McCloy was head of the World Bank, and then he became High Commissioner of Germany. It was basically the person who ruled Germany, who made all the decisions in the western sector of Germany. His wife was half German and distantly related to Germany's first Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer. Here's an interesting caricature that's carried around in the streets of East Berlin, showing Adenauer being sort of a puppet in the hands of McCloy, who was really above him as the High Commissioner. McCloy loved Germany. You see him here at the Oktoberfest in Munich drinking beer and holding a huge pretzel. You see him also, and maybe very important, as the High Commissioner of Germany, he insisted on continuing the legacy of the Bauhaus in Germany. He personally handed over a check over 1 million mark from the American taxpayers to Otto Eicher, Inge Eicher-Scholl, and in particular Max Bill, we talked about that earlier, to found the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm, the new post-war Bauhaus in southern Germany, one of the most important post-war design institutions. I mentioned already he was president of Chase Manhattan Bank, and he was a close advisor to President Kennedy, and a member of the Warren Commission after Kennedy's assassination. He was the one who brokered the compromise language that identified only one assassin. He remained a much sought advisor to many presidents. Throughout his political career, he was involved in the activities of the Secret Service. Harper's Magazine once called him the most influential private citizen in the history of the United States. But back to the Ford Foundation. I talked with the architect, Kevin Roach, who was 84, but sharp as a tack, wonderful, witty, and good to talk to. So I talked with him about this. And he remembered very clearly. He said McCloy was there all the time at the building committee, and he was the one who insisted on having his office at the very top. You see that door there? That's the only opening to the side, meaning the door is closed. And he was involved in this top floor of his office. And interestingly, Frances Saunders, in her book on the Cultural Cold War, chronicles the covert CIA involvement at many cultural Ford Foundation events in Europe. Among them are the financing of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the sponsoring of art exhibitions promoting abstract expressionism and the work of artists such as Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, and others. Or as Nelson Rockefeller once called it, free enterprise painting. They were all supported by the CIA through the Ford Foundation to, in fact, promote American contemporary art as being acceptable and cool and something that would sort of be a counterweight to the left-wing communist influence that was feared very much all over Europe. This Congress for Cultural Freedom existed from 1950 to 1966, when the New York Times, in a remarkable series of essays, uncovered the connections of the CIA, and also mentioned already the Ford Foundation, which began to spread unease among intellectuals towards this organization. Under John J. McCloy's leadership as chairman of the board, the Ford Foundation de-emphasized transparency and independence from the government considerably. He saw one role of the Ford Foundation to work in close cooperation with the government and its branches, which he had made clear during his time as a board member since 1953. As chairman, McCloy introduced a secret program in which CIA agents would directly approach recipients of the Ford Foundation money, so anybody who had gotten a grant, and after their grants had run out, they would be approached by the CIA to recruit them as agents. And he ran that secretly from his office up there. It's all, in great detail in this biography. He regularly offered the Ford Foundation services to the National Security Council in Washington. He loved acting behind the scenes and staying out of the spotlight. His office had only one door, as you can see, and no windows to the inside. His own access, also its own access by special elevator that went straight into the garage in the basement, so he could bring in foreign dignitaries or anybody he wanted to talk to without anybody else in the Ford Foundation seeing him. And Kevin Roach actually confirmed that to me, that was one of the things they discussed. The Ford Foundation's president, Henry T. Heald, of your IIT here in Chicago, did not condone McCloy's secret activities, and they had many clashes. The conflict between the two men grew visibly and escalated finally. Ultimately, John J. McCloy forced Henry Heald out and replaced him with a man called McGeorge Bundy. Some of you are nodding because you've heard of McGeorge Bundy, who had been National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson and was the key figure behind the planning and escalation of the Vietnam War, and of course deeply involved in Secret Service activities. The building of the Ford Foundation, with its interior garden, that in the eyes of many emphasized transparency, openness, benevolence, philanthropy, was designed at exactly the moment when the foundation moved to a considerable degree of secrecy and behind-the-scenes maneuvering, moving away from the independent, non-governmental organization that the Ford Foundation claimed it was. While Sheila Hicks' art seems potentially to critically comment on the power and involvement with the military-industrial complex, the garden design by Dan Kiley is probably somewhat complicit in it. I wanted to add something in sort of the form of an epilogue, if you like, in a very strange coincidence, and probably it is perhaps not more than that. Dan Kiley and John J. McCloy had actually met before, the garden architect and the chairman of the board had met before. Dan Kiley had been trained as an architect, and his very first job, when he was still in the army, was to design the courtroom for the Nuremberg trials after the war. As many of you know, there was a first round of trials for men like Goering and Hess and others who had orchestrated the Holocaust. And then there was a second round that went on until 47, 48, and so on, for people in business, administration, doctors and lawyers. This is the building, the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. You see it here. That adjacent building on the right is where the Nuremberg trial was held, and the top floor, here's the courtroom, which is used to this very day. This is what it looks like today. On the right, you see it with that coffered ceiling and those chandeliers hanging down. And Dan Kiley completely redesigned this courtroom, that existing courtroom. He knocked out the left side wall of that big room here in that drawing, which is in his own archive at Harvard. He knocked out that wall, and he turned the courtroom for those trials after the war that tried to bring the perpetrators of the Holocaust and the horrible crimes of the Nazi regime to justice into a stage so it could be seen by the whole world. This room is now ringed with booths for cameras. He installed new lights in the ceiling, took down those chandeliers and put up really bright lights so you could see everybody. He designed furniture, modern furniture, so that the judge would sit in a modern chair that was somewhat comfortable but looked straightforward and modern and readable. He designed benches, very uncomfortable benches, out of hope for the accused. And you see that here a little bit. All of this, was done by Dan Kiley. There are many hundreds of drawings, and the camera booths are around here. Let me show you. This is what it looked like. The ceiling, you see that the chandeliers are gone. There are all these very bright lights with fluorescent bulbs in them, and this wall was knocked out and turned into 2 levels of an audience space. Can you see it? You see there are about 300 seats, and all of that is unfortunately gone again. So this was the stage, and there were lights and camera booths all around, and everything was made as transparent and visible as possible, if you like. Here's the floor plan from his drawing with the new room for the audience that turned the main courtroom into a stage, if you like. While no one had any doubts about the moral justification of the trial, some legal experts pointed out that in simple legal terms, it was difficult to prosecute criminals who had acted within the legal framework of their own country. For Dan Kiley, it was an important task to make the courtroom as transparent and visible to the world as possible. John J. McCloy, in his role as the High Commissioner of Germany, attended the trials, but he did not believe in their results. A few years later, he quietly overruled the judges' verdicts and pardoned many of those who had been tried, restoring, for example, Alfred Krupp and Friedrich Flick's entire private fortune. And they had profited, of course, from the Nazi regime, from the war effort, from the Holocaust in major ways, turning both of them into two of the richest men in Europe. Eleanor Roosevelt angrily wrote a letter to John J. McCloy in which she asked him, and I quote, "Why are we freeing so many Nazis?" One cannot miss seeing some parallels in architecture's use here. Both cases signal transparency, openness. Here's Friedrich Flick being pardoned by John J. McCloy. One cannot miss seeing some parallels in architecture's use here. It signaled transparency, openness, fairness, while John J. McCloy had entirely different ideas behind the scenes. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions, of course.
This is kind of a speculation, but do you think that maybe McCloy's appreciation of the Bauhaus architecture was because its emphasis on like phenomenal transparency was useful to him as like a kind of a ruse for a kind of misdirection?
That's a very good observation. Probably everybody heard the question. Obviously, there was a certain appeal, right, to the idea that architecture could, in fact, and that was a fairly new idea in the 20th century, that it could sort of signify moral values such as transparency and openness to through particular use of architectural elements. That I think it's very likely. That's a very good point. Actually, very good point. I completely agree.
Kevin Roche and John Winklevoss had been the partners of Vera Saarinen, who had just died, as you pointed out. And in fact, you quickly showed us three of that office's masterpieces, the Dallas Airport, and so on. And you did not show, but I'm willing to bet my last penny that you are also a great admirer of the Deer headquarters building. And what I've always been curious about, I wonder if you can shed any light on this, is how much in some of these buildings was aero and how much was heavy. And this becomes even more significant, I think, when we remember that Kevin Roche had studied with Mies.
He studied, very good point, Kevin Roche came to Chicago to study with Mies, and the way he told me, he stayed only for a year and felt that Mies's pedagogical approach, which consisted basically of being absolutely silent, and while they were looking at Kevin Roche's designs, sort of frustrated him after a while. And wonderful stories, of course, of Mies basically just ending, a long period of silence with saying something like, "Naja," and then he would say, "I wouldn't do that," and then he would walk off. So it was, for Kevin Roche, it wasn't enough, so he got frustrated after a year. But I think your question, he started with Mies too. And is that how you remember this one? That's
quite correct.
I must admit, I can't fully answer your, obviously very justified question of how much Roche and Dinkeloo is already in those Saarinen buildings.
How much Saarinen, how much Roche?
Yeah, that's, as often I think it's we don't really know. And
we never know.
I mean, we have only, Kevin Roche to ask, and he's a wonderful, funny, and modest man. I don't think he would sort of make too many claims. He loved Saarinen, but I mean, as it goes in all these big offices, but the sort of the one who gives the name to the office is probably sort of stopping by on his desk once in a while, but who designs and invents all the great special ideas and details is always a little vague and hard to pinpoint.
Thank you for the rather chilling story. It's quite revealing. I'm curious in the JFK side of this. Does McCoy get to JFK through Papa, or is it through the sort of the power bases of the East Coast, or is it some other?
I think it's through the power bases. He was already so well connected when Kennedy comes along that he was just a force to be reckoned with, and a lot of presidents just felt that he had the connections and the insights and the lack of vanity. He never wanted to be in the spotlight, that he was a good person to work with. And he,
were there connections between McCoy and Joseph Kennedy before, back to 30?
I have not read that. I would have to go back to papers, but that's a great, I mean, Joseph Kennedy was such a colorful picture. But I doubt it. I don't think I read anything about it, but he wasn't as much involved in the East Coast establishment politics. He was obviously trying to make a name in movie making, for a while. Joseph Kennedy had the idea of becoming a movie mogul and moved to Los Angeles and fell in love with Gloria Swanson and spent a lot of money on this actress while he was cheating, obviously, on JFK's mother, and a whole other dark story. That's for another time. Any other questions? Yes?
I was struck with your research and talking about all these interviews that you've done with architects or artists or people involved with the Ford Foundation. And I was wondering if you could just talk about how you approach your scholarship in a project like this, where you can interview people in the project, and maybe your other projects that about the Barcelona Pavilion or Italian fascist architecture.
Yeah, this was a little unusual. I hadn't worked in that period before, and it took a moment until I suddenly realized I can actually just send an email to Jonathan Barnett and see what he thought, or I can call up Ken Frenton and see what he's saying, and call up Sheila Hicks, which I did in Paris and so on. That's usually I've been working in a period a little further down in the early 20th century. So for the Barcelona Pavilion, I just relied entirely on countless hours of archival work in Spain and in Germany and Berlin and so on. And there's a very dark story behind the Barcelona Pavilion as well. One of the key points I found out is that the man who actually financed it against the wishes of the German government, they didn't want the pavilion, they didn't want to pay for it, so this man stepped forward, who was the German commissioner, financed it, bankrolled it, and paid a lot of it out of his own pocket. He was a right-wing, right-wing politician, and in the end worked with the Nazis and was also at the Nuremberg trials and convicted. And John J. McCloy, he was among those who was pardoned by John J. McCloy, but he was the one who actually made the Barcelona Pavilion possible and financed it and made sure Mies actually got it done. So that's all archival work, and there are no interviews to be done. In fact, I've always been a little suspicious of people's memories, because I think memories are a little overrated, so I usually go for archival.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. I was wondering that, like, as a historian, does a project like this, where you can do interviews, make it easier or more fraught for you in sort of your interpretation then?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I feel in the case of Kevin Rhodes, the way I formulated the question was sort of innocent enough that I got a fairly straightforward answer of what he remembered, but obviously nothing about that you just said you booked for Mies, but I've had cases where I talked to, let's say, Mies's grandson here in town or other people who knew Mies. It's very hard, and Dirk Lowen, I was just talking to him 2 weeks ago here in Chicago, and he said, well, people read so many books on Mies and the stories, and then it's very hard to separate, even for those who've been there, what they remember and what they have read, and which sort of somewhat gets all mixed up sometimes, and so it's very hard to work this out. Memory is not a precise resource usually, but in some cases it can help. So with Sheila Hicks, as I pointed out, I didn't get out of her what I'd hoped for, a real quotable sentence about basically creating this subversive work of art that put gold coins into the Ford Foundation and made it look like the heads of Vietnamese rice farmers, which I think, you know, if that's what she had in mind, was absolutely brilliant, but I have no proof, but that's just sort of my interpretation. She didn't say, no, this is absolutely wrong when I asked her, but yeah, absolutely needs to oral history, of course.
Just one quick one. I mean, part of the story is about really the development of the atrium building type in a certain sense. So like interiorization of the landscape, does it have more promising progeny than this? Or does it have more, maybe paradoxical ones that we would work with? Like, our commercial version is actually more popular than the philanthropic one.
That's a wonderful point. Of course, you think of Portman, you know, the interior hotels, and it's interesting that it came, of course, from the Brown Palace Hotel, which is really the first one I know who has seen it. I've been there once. It's an impressive interior of 1892, and those hotels Portman did in New York and in Atlanta and so on are clearly followers, but it lost, you were absolutely right, in that philanthropic environment, which was also, of course, trying to be both open and extremely secretive. It didn't work very well as a welcoming space. In commercial, you know, if you go to the Sony Center and the old AT&T and others, I think it's, you know, it's fair enough that interiors may have warm, you can sit there and have a cup of tea or something. That's a very good point. This particular situation didn't really establish itself. It's because, you know, only the commercial version, which then looks quite different, ended up being successful. So it's quite a luxury that the Ford Foundation affords itself, but unfortunately they don't really make it accessible because they are still very afraid and secretive, although I would say they've greatly changed, and as far as I can tell, there's nothing nefarious going on at this point anymore in the Ford Foundation. They're a wonderful director. So, but very good point. Oh, yes, okay.
Thanks again, Dietrich. Maybe for a broad question, when the architect realizes he or she is working for the bad guy, what move should they make?
What move should they make? That is a very good question. My impression was that Kevin Roach never fully realized that he was working for the bad guy. I don't think he ever read Taylor's biography, that huge tome, you know, that won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's just so detailed. I don't think he had time for that. He has, to this day, a very busy office and so on. But that is, I think, a wonderful question. I have no answer, but of course that is, you know, accompanies architecture all the way back to at least the Renaissance, right? If you look at the Medici, they were not pleasant people to hang out with either, and they were, of course, great patrons of the art. And that is a wonderful question. What should one do, right? If you have a wife and children to support, and you need the money, and you have an office full of employees, that is the big, hard question. And back to Mies, interestingly, Mies, I think, was tempted. He would have worked for the Nazis if they had given him something to do. I think that's quite obvious. However, the interesting thing is the Nazis had very clear stylistic ideas. They wanted, you know, pitched roofs for private homes, and they wanted a little classicism in the facade for their public buildings. And that was the point where Mies was not willing to compromise. Thank you very much.